I have been, working on this series for, I think at this point, like 6 or 7 months, slowly chipping away, kind of a survey course in logic and really specifically logical fallacies. And the title of the series is Logic Saves Lives. So when I saw the title, Logic is Not Enough, I was interested to hear what you meant. And of course, we know that logic alone is not sufficient for always coming to correct conclusions. Maybe, first of all, maybe it would be better if you could just give us an abstract, like a rundown on what the purpose of that show was.
Right. Well, as the title would indicate, basically the premise, the underlying premise is that logic would be a necessary but not sufficient condition for arriving at truth certainty. But I think the more the secondary sort of conclusion that I tried to draw out was that not only is logic a necessary but not sufficient for coming to truth certainty, but that truth certainty as a goal in and of itself is not only something that I think is ultimately unattainable, but something that I don't think should be strived towards as an ideal, because it tends toward an ideology, a mindset that I think is amenable to the types of swaying by people with social control as their main idea. And I think they do this through a type of scientism that has been bred into the population. Now, this gets into a lot of different areas, but I think something that I was trying to draw out to a certain extent is that a lot of what we are interested in are valuations that are not themselves empirically reducible. And I would point people in the direction of someone like Martin Heidegger and his work, The Question Concerning Technology, talking about the attempt by modern science to reduce everything to empirically derivable results, which themselves reduce the world to what he called standing reserve. And I think a part of that is this notion that drives the scientific dictatorship crowd and the people like the Welleses and the Huxleys and others who had that idea, which is to try to reduce everything to empirically derivable and logically reproducible arguments that will lead inevitably to a certain conclusion, which almost always, when it's presented in that context, is going to be, well, we need social control of this form to produce this type of individual. And it can be quite compelling when that idea is put into a logical argumentation form. So that was kind of the gamut of ideas I was trying to cram into that episode, but I may or may not have failed in attempting to put that all in.
No, I found the show to be an important reminder, and there's a 3-word quote by Ayn Rand that's been uttered on my show probably well over 100 times. Check your premises. And you were saying that somebody could be perfectly syllogistically sound and still arrive at a faulty conclusion, right? So this is where background knowledge is very important, and it raised this question also in the episode: are people logical? And it seemed to be that the conclusion was leaning towards no. Based on a lot of the experience that I've had in debate with people, I would often say, "Gosh, yeah, people are just not they're just not logical." But I think that's a little bit dismissive on my part. I think that people, whether they're logical or not, they certainly have a sensitivity to and an awareness of it. In other words, I've never been having a debate with somebody where they say, "Oh, Brett, here's something you should know about me. I just say things that make me feel good, and I really don't care whether they're true or not. It's just kind of my thing." No one ever says that. Everyone always acts as if they have a reason to believe what they believe. The problem that I observed in other people and myself for a long time was one of empiricism, where, for the most part, most of the people I deal with, the inputs, the senses, they work just fine. It's something happens. There's almost like a buffer, like a program that's been installed into the brain that disrupts a clear assessment of what the inputs are giving them. Like, they see a man in a costume hitting an unarmed person with a stick, And but then there's this program that says, I wonder what the unarmed person who's getting hit with the stick did wrong, you know, because we have this context that we see all this stuff in. But at the same time, these people would always want to offer reasons for what they believe and why. It's just, the premises need to be checked. I was having a debate with somebody about gun control recently. And I was talking about the genocides that had happened in a lot of countries out in your neck of the woods after gun bans, Cambodia, for one, China. And the person said, I never heard anything like that. And I paused for a minute. And, I wanted to be sensitive and sympathetic and try to understand what it would be like to try and process what is going on in the mainstream media right now in terms of this whole gun discussion without any knowledge, any background knowledge that governments have used, disarming the public as a precursor to slaughtering them. And to not understand that concept, to be missing that piece of background knowledge, or to try and interact with somebody who's missing that piece of background knowledge, you're not really having a debate, even though they might take whatever information that they've gathered from wherever they've gathered it and be able to organize it properly and produce clear, logical relationships with that information. All their premises are wrong. So I think it's important to recognize, and in the last Logic Saves Lives show we did actually dealt a lot with the emotions, that this is more complicated than, having sound arguments yourself and pointing out the fallacies that other people are using to really have clear communication and for people to arrive productively and efficiently at mutual understanding. So I found the show to be very useful.
Yes, well, I don't disagree with anything that you're saying there, and perhaps I'm one step ahead of the game because I'm kind of arguing. I'm not arguing against the use of logical argumentation. I'm trying to argue against the reliance on a mindset, as I say, that feeds into an ideology whereby what we are striving for is the type of truth certainty where everything will be 100% deducible. And what I'm trying to posit here is something against, for example, the ideology that's driving, for example, the proponents of the Zeitgeist Venus Project type ideas, where what I see as the fundamental problem with that is something that was again articulated, I think, quite well by Adam Curtis in Pandora's Box, where he went over the history of Magnitogorsk in the Soviet Union as this type of community that they were trying to bring in, that was going to be the manufacturing center and the proud beacon of industrial manufacturing for the Soviet Union. And it went over in great detail how the central planning of the Soviets ended up failing so signally. And that's because it got to this ridiculous point where they were getting literally reams and reams and reams and reams and reams of data from all parts of the Soviet Union. The central planners were getting this information, and then they were having to make decisions like, for example, what color toothbrush should we produce, and how many of them will we need? What kind of stockings will women want, and what's the best way to produce that, et cetera, et cetera. So you have these central planners that are trying to use this data to try to process this information. Where, I mean, the ridiculousness of it really hits you when you start to see that, for example, they were literally trying to use this data to try to determine what color toothbrush to give people. And this, to me, is the ridiculousness of this idea that we're all going to live in plastic cities with computers that are going to use some algorithm which has never been produced, but we're assured exists, which has solved the calculation problem that's been put forward by Mises and others, that it is somehow it's going to be able to tell us exactly what we are going to want and the exact best way to produce that. And I am very, very, very skeptical of that, because I think it does come down to things which are not subject to ultimately rational discourse. I mean, what color toothbrush you want is not something that is ever going to have any sort of rational basis. And you could argue that it's such a trivial thing that it doesn't matter. So just make it whatever the natural color of the plastic is and just give everyone the same color kind of thing. But I think fundamentally that goes against sort of human nature. I don't like to employ that term, but I think that at a certain base level, we need that room for individual whims to be included, at least to have a space for that in any system. So I'm just against this idea of some sort of scientific dictatorship where sort of robots and computers and algorithms are going to tell us how to run our lives. And I'm not seeing that as an imminent possibility. I'm just saying that that's where I see things going down the road. So again, in terms of arguing with people, I am all for using and employing logically valid arguments, but I don't want to hold that up as the ideal that we're striving towards some sort of truth certainty that's going to tell us that exactly how to sort of live our lives and everything down to the nth detail. I think it's that type of micromanagement which is part of the scientific dictatorship mentality, which is something that I've been sort of contemplating and worrying about for a long time, because I think that is the ultimate end result of things like the Brave New World type of world that has been being constructed for at the very least a century through the diligent work of the various social controls and behaviorists and others who want to basically puppeteer society.
Yes, this technical dictatorship. It sounds like a guaranteed nightmare scenario playing out. Like all the things that failed with humans and communism, let's just try them again with robots. And I know maybe that's not what Peter Joseph is pushing exactly, or even close, but there is this problem with these predictive models for the management of society, and this was one of the great problems with communism, like you mentioned, is that they always failed to take into account human action and human emotion, because you can't. You can't put those into systems, and this is why we see all of these societies that started out with such beautiful dreams of the future in China and in Russia deteriorate so quickly into these violent totalitarian hellholes, because I think the people at the top, and whether we're talking about the top of the government or the most influential people in pushing the ideology or in seeing that the ideology survives, they're like, this is a beautiful plan and it's going to work. Humans be damned. And the humans were damned in that scenario. Because they had to conform or be forced to conform to fit into these rigid models. And of course, we see that today after over 100 years of government school in the United States, where, there is a lot of planning. There is a lot of bean counting. And whenever you have any top-down system of control like that, people got to act right. As far as the controllers are concerned. And, how have they dealt with it in schooling in America? Well, drugs are coming into it. This is one of the things that's mentioned in a lot of these dystopian, I hate to laugh because it's not funny, but these dystopian science fiction future books where the people are drugged, the zero tolerance, the totalitarian state that comes alive in the schools. These all start out with well thought out plans that if you check the person's logic alone, they seem to be on the right track. But what always seems to be absent is the consideration for human action and human emotion.
That's right. And it goes back to what we were saying earlier in this conversation where we're talking about the neocons and others. And there are people who genuinely do believe in these ideologies. And I think that in and of itself is something that's important to remember, and something that's in some ways scariest to consider, because people are so often led into the most horrific atrocities because they genuinely do believe that they're striving for a better world. And people who are genuinely motivated by that belief that they have, that they are on the right track, and so anyone who is opposed to them must be eliminated, I think that leads to the most horrific despotism that we've seen throughout history.
Oh, yeah. I've never admitted this on the show before, but I remember being a young liberal and, right out of college, maybe still in college. And I actually said this out loud one day. I said, I wish people could just be made to think how I do. I didn't know there was whole teams of work on that in academia and government and the media. It was just kind of a fleeting thought. I think I might have said something like that to my father, who always fancied himself more of a conservative and eventually a libertarian. And he was like, Jesus, Brett. It was something that got that response. But
well, at least you were able to consciously articulate that. I think a lot of people do believe that. They just don't actually. They would never admit that to themselves.
Yeah. No, I think it was just the feeling of being so young and naive to a certain extent, and having such an exposure to all of this new information. I wrote down a couple quotes from the episode. I wanted to ask you about this one. You can't be rational without being emotional. We always think about that as or maybe it's a misconception, but that's like a dichotomy. It's either or. What does that mean? You can't be rational without being emotional.
Well, I think that, again, this is part of understanding the totality of humanity rather than just trying to partition it out. And I think that there are emotional considerations in the psyche of human beings that cannot and should not be discounted. I don't remember that precise quote, actually, so I don't know the context in which it came. But that would be my first approximation at an answer.
I think it was in one of the clips that you played.
Right. Yes. Actually, yeah. There was a clip that I played, and part of what I was trying to demonstrate there is also I think we can't dismiss the psychological understanding of humanity that we've gained in the past century and a half or so. I'm not certainly not to say that Freud was right about everything or something like that, but I think that an understanding of the subconscious drives is absolutely essential to understanding humanity, because we keep getting this experimentally confirmed, et cetera, in studies. I mean, I'm sure people have heard about some of the recent studies that have come out that show that people are more likely to believe information that corresponds to their underlying ideology and discount information that doesn't. I mean, there's actually been studies on this recently, so that there's kind of it's baked into the cake that people are more likely to sort of side with or to even process information that conforms with their view of reality. But this shouldn't be surprising to us. I mean, I think we should understand that we are motivated by subconscious drives and instincts that we only dimly, if ever, comprehend, and that a lot of our reasoning is post facto, that we come up with rationalizations for things after the fact. And I think we have to understand that there is that sort of emotional and instinctual underpinning to so much of what we do. And to understand humanity without understanding that, I think, is the height of folly.
I've said on my show before that metacognition, or thinking about our thinking, is something that's relatively new. But, I've also kind of, for most people, I think that thinking, like real deep thought about our feelings and even that might be relatively new. I mean, if you look at the way most people lived 100 years ago, 150 years ago, working on a farm, 18-hour days, certainly it wasn't everybody. Certainly there's always been a leisure class that has had time for these kinds of things. But these huge pockets of free time that we enjoy today have allowed, more and more of us to go into our own minds and start to understand these things in a way a majority of people might have lived their whole lives without ever even contemplating. I think it's interesting.
I agree completely. I think that our environmental situation produces or fails to produce the type of room for reflection on that. And I could see the development of human society as kind of the development of human consciousness at the same time. And I think there is a kind of combination and an interplay of the economic conditions that create the space for this type of discussion. I mean, it's interesting to me to think of, if I had been born 100 years ago, I mean, I certainly wouldn't be doing this, and I certainly wouldn't be living in Japan. I mean, my family roots go back to Newcastle in northern England, so I would probably be down in a coal mine working 16 hours a day. And it's bizarre to me to think of that, because it's so far detached from who I think I am, at least in this present age, and what I've been able to express and articulate, and the person I've developed into. And it's interesting to think of ourselves as the product of our environment, and it's not something we often get the chance to do, because we want to protect our identity. We think there's something core about who we are in this particular circumstance that is us. But just a slightly different timing of your birth, and you'd be a completely different human being. And I think it's important for us to reflect on that, and to understand and process human history in terms of the economic conditions and the technological conditions, et cetera, that were holding sway during that time frame as well.
And it's really wonderful that we were born at a time, since we're not, part of the aristocrat class, and or well-born, or that we had logic. Through the technology that we have, we had logic available as a tool to us. I think people they do naturally develop some logical processes, but the things that we've been able to learn and communicate to other people it's information. It's tools we would not have had access to had we been born 100 years ago. Certainly, there's people who've always understood this. There's people, any time in history who have used an understanding of this against people like us 100 years ago, 150 years ago, 1,000 years ago. So the fact that we have in our hands this tool that allows us to get emotional needs met, because I think that's what it's really about. And one of the ideas that was communicated in that episode is that sometimes you don't even see this process going on, right? It's happening kind of behind the scenes in the background, but it is happening. Logic is very much a strategy, I think, for getting personal needs met, where sometimes it might be easier or even more personally advantageous to not behave in a reasonable, rational manner. But there is like an emotional need for belonging and acceptance that, kind of encourages us to act logically.
Well, that's an extremely good way to put it. In fact, perhaps that hits the nail on the head a little more squarely than what I've articulated, because I think ultimately logic is a tool, and it's a very useful tool and an extremely important one for us to understand how to wield, and to understand that it can be wielded for values that are contrary to the ones that we have. So I think it's important to understand that it is a tool that can be wielded for great things and also for destructive ends as well, if that's the purpose. So I think, again, it comes down to core values that are motivating the use of that tool.
Yeah. Now, when we talk about that, just for a minute, logic being used against people, what does that mean to you? What do you think are some examples of that?
Well, again, I would point towards people like Bertrand Russell and others who had, I think, very logical arguments for why we do need a
Sure.
world government, and we need to subsume our individual sovereignty to that in order to protect world peace. And again, if the argument is framed in a certain way and the premises are presented as fait accompli, then looking at the birth of the nuclear era, well, then obviously, how else are we going to protect ourselves against these nuclear powers that have these nuclear weapons? We need an authority that's above these individual nation states in order to control the type of nuclear war that we can see coming to shape. So one could understand how someone like Bertrand Russell could have even perhaps been motivated by genuine desire for promoting an ideology that he thought would actually save billions of lives. But at the same time, it's an ideology that just happens to correspond to exactly what has been written about has been quested after for totalitarians since basically the dawn of human civilization, which is total control in a centralized authority over the entire globe. And that's actually something that is sort of coming into view at this point. It's something that's even feasible to contemplate, the idea of global governance becoming global government, and perhaps being done so for reasons that themselves sound laudable, and through arguments that, if one accepts the premises, can follow logically through valid argumentation towards the inevitable end of global government. So I think that that's one example of how that can be wielded. And again, as you say, it's back to check your premises. And if the premises are that we need some centralized authority in order to protect us from, the tyranny of individual nation states wreaking nuclear war, then I think, if we have to accept the existence of nation states and then accept the existence of global government, then it can be a logical argumentation, but it stems from false premises.
You do a lot of media analysis on your show. Also, by the way, it's refreshing to see you once in a while on RT. But as far as media analysis is concerned, this is all wildly popular today, where the basic function of the mainstream media, or the basic setup for most of their presentations, is that they will present to us, the audience, experts. What these experts bring to the table, as far as a grammar, as far as a background knowledge, as far as definitions, it cannot be questioned. Who are you? You're the guy watching TV. how could you question my definitions, my background knowledge? They will then, put all the work with all that stuff in logical relationships that make sense to us, that don't usually. Obviously, depending on what the presentation is, there could be, an episode of Real Time with Bill Maher or an episode of the O'Reilly Factor. You could identify 60 or 70 fallacies, but they do still have some adherence that most people will accept to logic. It's the background knowledge is really where you get us. And this presentation of these people on television as experts is something that really goes unquestioned. And unfortunately, it's very, very difficult to do that because, first of all, our schooling has given us this idea that we don't know as much as the person who's at the front of the room, who, when we are adults, becomes the person on the other side of the television screen. And we don't have a lot of confidence in our ability to question those things. So one of the reasons why I pursued the logic series was at least give yourself, you're not going to be an expert on the Cyprus banking situation. You're not going to be an expert on the Middle East. You're not going to be an expert on Goldman Sachs. For most people, that's just not going to be the situation. So at least install an alarm system that will go off periodically when people are really, really trying to pull one over on you. Like the fallacies were a way to see how much BS people try to throw at you. And even though when we're working, through the trivium, we don't start with logic, but it is maybe a way to understand when somebody is trying to deceive you without having expertise on whatever the subject is that they're presenting.
Well, agreed. Again, it is important to understand those types of fallacies and how they are employed and what it means when someone is presenting a fallacious argument, basically that their argument doesn't support what they're trying to say. So that is important. But again, it can't be a logically valid argument that's presented. Again,
Sure.
If it has false premises, then it can lead to the false conclusion, and it might sound very convincing. So again, logic is not enough in that sense, not necessary, but not sufficient. But it does go back to the point of media analysis. And on that note, I recently had an episode of my podcast on the myth of objective journalism, which is, it's interesting, again, to look at the idea of objectivity in journalism and where this idea sprang from, and the fact that it's really more or less a 20th century invention that stems back to people like Walter Lippmann, who was, along with Edward Bernays, another key person in the development of public relations and our modern era of thinking on society and how it should be structured. And when you start to interrogate that notion, it completely falls apart. The media, of course, wants to present itself as giving to you objective truth, and it will present both sides of the argument and you can decide, kind of thing. But of course, what information they cover and who they turn to cover it, and even the language in which they present each and every story is in of itself a decision that is made from a certain ideological standpoint. And there's no way to eliminate that. There's no way to say that we can eliminate that, because again, it stems right down to even what type of language you use. If you're calling someone a terrorist or a freedom fighter, you have to call them something, and both are going to be ideologically loaded terms that come from a certain paradigm and certain perspective. So I think we have to understand that the media has been specifically constructed, and I think consciously constructed, to present information in the exact type of way that corresponds to the Prussian education system that we've all been indoctrinated in, which, as you say, is that centralized authority presenting you with information as it is, as truth, that we simply have to accept, rather than trying to present a process, present actually the process of coming to an understanding of information, which is much more valuable. Even if you are coming from an ideological perspective that is completely contrary to mine, as long as I understand the perspective you're coming from and you allow me to see your reasoning process, then I can examine the sort of reasoning for its own merits, rather than trying to just take what you're saying and your conclusions and trying to argue against them. I think we have to put our cards on the table, ideologically speaking. And to a certain extent, that's what the internet and internet alternative media, at least the potential is, that we are once again, each and every one of us, becoming at the very least editors of our own information, and to a large extent kind of reporters in our own world as well. And this is an important shift that's taking place right now as we see the decentralization of knowledge, which I mean is such an important point in this process. But again, if we don't have that underlying understanding of how logical argumentation and how reasoning can work and should function, then we will be lost in this mess, because again, we will try to turn to experts to try to tell us what the facts are and simply turn our minds off.
Have you had success? You know, we're talking about trying to put this all together as far as a process, not of just understanding, but of communication as well. Have you had success in your own life, meaning outside of the show, communicating these ideas? And it can be whatever topic, you know, you're following, whatever you're particularly passionate about, communicating effectively to other people face to face.
I would say both yes and no, and sometimes at the same time. Because one thing that I've found is that almost invariably, when I'm talking to people one-on-one, no matter how strongly they might be coming from a completely different worldview, a different perspective, we can often find the base things that we agree upon, the base the values or goals or whatever it may be that we hold in common. But of course, we have completely different ways of looking at that problem and how to solve it, and that can be an interesting contradiction, because there are times at which I've been talking to people that we agree on a certain perspective, or we agree on a certain historical event or something. They might agree that the official narrative of 9/11 is full of holes and can't possibly be the case, etc. Whatever the case may be. But when we actually start to examine the ideological assumptions underlying all of that and what that means politically, etc., we completely diverge. So I've had more or less success in talking to people, but I've never really seen it as my goal to proselytize about what I'm talking about, so much as simply to open up the conversation and open up the dialogue. And if my role was nothing other than to put these ideas out there in a form, in a presentation that shows a type of reasoning process behind them that can be scrutinized and understood by other people, if that alone was all I was accomplishing, I think that would be in and of itself be valuable. Because again, I do want to break down those types of assumptions that we work on, that there are people from on high who are simply presenting us with facts and information as fait accompli that we can't ever question. And I think simply the process of showing people the questioning and the working against that received wisdom is in and of itself valuable. So I mean, it's incredibly difficult to gauge the success that you have on an individual level with individual people, because I have probably I can't remember very many conversations that I've ever participated in where someone has changed their worldview simply because someone laid out an argument that was persuasive.
Sure.
And one wouldn't expect that to happen. People have paradigms and worldviews and ideologies that are strongly held to and generally only fall away piece by piece after a long time of quiet contemplation, or at least that's my understanding of it. But I think we can be more or less effective in at least communicating our differences with other people. And in that regard, I think I have had some very interesting conversations with people where we do disagree, but we find those points of agreement. And that, in some ways, can be the most sort of exciting kinds of conversations that you can have with people.
Absolutely. You know, I haven't been at the podcasting thing quite as long as you, but I remember in the beginning for me, I was really... I used to spend so much time editing because I was so apprehensive about saying the wrong thing. And, you know, I had a real quality audience right from the beginning because I got a lot of people from Stefan Molyneux's Free Domain Radio, and I got a lot of people from Wes Bertrand's Complete Liberty who were on board almost right from the beginning. So I knew there was a lot of smart people listening and watching, and that was part of it. But I was really, I felt like I was afraid to tread into new territory a lot of the time. So that struck me when you said, you know, you see yourself as a facilitator of a conversation. I initially saw myself as somebody who was expected to have answers. And it's only recently, you know, I've been listening to a lot of Rogan lately, and I really like his style. You know, I mean, I know that he doesn't come exactly from the same place that we might, but I think in a way, for me anyway, to see what he does, to see his approach, it seems very liberating because he's not afraid to entertain new topics and he's not afraid to put people across the table. Not that I've ever been afraid. I've been all too anxious to put someone across the table from me who disagrees. And maybe that's not a good thing because I wasn't really thinking about what need I had for that conversation, like I just want to bully them intellectually, and now I'm really interested in talking to and maybe even having some polite debate with people who have very, very different points of view and being more of a facilitator of a conversation. Did you feel that pressure initially when you were more maybe influenced by these other media creators and you were first cutting your teeth? Like, if I'm going to turn on the mic and talk into it and put it on the internet, I got to be right.
I certainly did have that apprehension at first as well. I think everyone does when they start out with this. And I think that that's something that's very, very difficult for someone who doesn't produce media to appreciate because there is that tendency that people have that they want to only put out something that's perfect and that will perfectly convey all of their ideas in just the way that they want it conveyed to other people. Of course, that is a pipe dream, and perhaps my perspective as an English literature major back in the day, if that was useful for anything, I think it was at least useful for getting me to interrogate that notion that you'll ever be able to 100% perfectly convey an idea through language, which itself is this amorphous sand, which, it's received differently than it's sent out. And there are so many trillions and trillions of different little variables that can play into even the simplest of sentences, let alone big chunks of discourse. So I've always been a bit wary of that idea that I'd ever be able to put forward an idea completely 100% into the minds of the listeners through any piece of media I produce. But certainly, I think over the years, you start to realize that there's only so much that you can do, and it's better to produce something and to be honest about where you're coming from and what's informing your perspective, and just putting those cards on the table in order to try to facilitate that conversation.
Don't be a bad boy, Johnny.